This took place a few years back, in early October. I had 2 weeks off from work and decided to take a trip to a cabin in the hills just outside of my city. It was an Airbnb located far from civilization, which was perfect since I wanted to spend a few days camping as well. The drive took about 2 hours, and I arrived in the afternoon. The place was incredibly peaceful, no other cabins or buildings were visible, just the forest stretching out in all directions. I settled in, checking out the cabin's interior, but it wasn't anything extraordinary. It had a charming, old-fashioned vibe, which wasn't exactly my style, but it was a refreshing change for a vacation. The next few days passed uneventfully. I spent most of my time relaxing, enjoying the cool autumn air outdoors during the day, and cozying up by the fireplace at night. On the 5th day, I decided it was time to set off for my camping trip. I wasn't sure how long I'd stay out, maybe 2 or 3 nights, but I packed for the adventure. There were a couple of trails nearby that I had researched beforehand, but only one connected directly to the cabin. To keep things simple, I chose that one so I wouldn't need to drive anywhere. After hiking for about 3 or 4 hours, I found a clearing that seemed like a good spot. It was the only open space I had come across, aside from the trail itself, and I didn't feel comfortable camping right on the path. It was nearing nightfall, so I set up my tent and built a fire. As the darkness closed in, I put on my heavy sweater and jacket to ward off the chill, and sat by the fire for about an hour, eating a quick meal and waiting to get tired. Then, while sitting there, I noticed something, a figure moving in the woods. I watched as they walked through the darkness without a flashlight, eventually disappearing into the distance. The only light around was my campfire, aside from the faint moonlight, so whoever it was must have seen me. It struck me as extremely strange, who would be walking through the woods, off-trail, with no light. The whole situation made me uneasy, and I briefly considered heading back to the cabin. But it was too late and risky to walk the long trail back in the dark. I stayed alert for about half an hour, scanning the woods, but saw no further signs of the person. Eventually, I felt tired, so I put out the fire. Just as the last embers faded, I heard footsteps coming from the left side of my campsite. My heart raced as I strained to see in the dark, but I could only make out a few feet in front of me. The footsteps got louder, coming closer to my campsite, and then, just as they seemed to be right at the edge of my vision, they veered off, continuing into the woods without stopping. It was unsettling. There was no way this could be a coincidence, someone wandering so close to where I was camped. Once the footsteps faded, I grabbed my flashlight, quickly disassembled my tent, and packed everything up. Something felt wrong about the whole situation, so I decided to hike back to the cabin, even though it wasn't ideal. The woods were eerily quiet as I hurried down the trail, keeping my flashlight aimed ahead and trying to stay calm. Despite my unease, I made it back to the cabin in the middle of the night, exhausted from all the walking and lack of sleep. I collapsed on the couch and fell asleep almost immediately. Hours later, I was jolted awake by a strange noise, like wood scraping against the side of the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and I turned to look toward the back of the room, where I saw a man slowly pushing the window open. Our eyes locked, and the moment I stood up, he dropped the window and bolted into the woods. By the time I reached the window, he was already gone, disappearing into the forest. I quickly gathered my things and left the cabin, driving to a nearby town where I checked into a hotel. I still have no idea who that man was or why he followed me, but clearly, he had tracked me back to the cabin and tried to break in while I was asleep. There's no telling what might have happened if he had succeeded. This happened last fall, toward the end of the season as winter approached. Where I live, it gets pretty cold around that time, and we sometimes even get snow in October. I've been doing food delivery for about 3 years, and I was working on this particular night. It was around 1 p.m., and light snow was falling, one of the first snowfalls of the season. People seemed hesitant to go out, so there weren't many cars on the road, but orders were coming in non-stop. As soon as I'd finish one delivery, another one would pop up. I kept busy, driving around until almost 1 a.m., when I accepted one last order for the night. The snow was starting to come down harder, and I was getting a bit tired. I swung by the McDonald's where the order was placed, picked up the food, and entered the directions into my GPS. The delivery was only about 10 minutes away, but I hadn't realized it was in the opposite direction of where I lived. I was already about 25 minutes from home, so this delivery was going to add more time to my drive back. Feeling a bit frustrated with myself, I left the parking lot and headed down the road. The snowplows hadn't come out yet, probably because no one expected this much snow, but my SUV usually handled well in the snow, so I wasn't too worried. As I drove, I noticed that the route was taking me out of the main part of town. I checked the map again, and it was definitely leading me the right way, but it felt strange. I hadn't realized there were any houses out here, as most people only use this road to get to the highway that leads out of state. After driving down the road for a few minutes, passing nothing but streetlights and trees, I finally came to the turnoff. It was a small, narrow street lined with trees, and I slowed down to be extra cautious, knowing how easy it would be to slide off in the snow. The driveways here were long and led to houses barely visible through the trees. I followed the GPS until I reached the driveway for the house I needed. It looked just like the others, and after slowly making my way up the snow-covered driveway, I arrived at the house. The house was medium-sized, older, and completely covered in snow. There wasn't anything particularly interesting about it except for the fact that it was so isolated, out in the middle of a forest. I parked, grabbed the food, and began walking toward the door. The snow was deeper than I'd expected, soaking my shoes and even the lower part of my pants. When I reached the porch, I knocked on the door and started to set the bag down, but before I could, the door swung open. A large man stood there in a winter jacket, his face pale as if he'd just come in from the cold. "Hey, I've got your order here," I said, holding the bag up. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped back and opened the door wider. "You can set it down in there," he said, gesturing toward what looked like the kitchen. Something about the way he said it made me feel uneasy, but I knew it was a terrible idea to step inside. I glanced at his hands, noticing he wasn't holding anything, so there was no reason for me to go in. "Sorry, I've got to get going," I said, feeling nervous as I held the bag out to him again. His expression changed, and he frowned before slamming the door shut. A bit stunned, I set the bag down on the porch and quickly headed back to my car. Just as I was walking past the front yard, I heard a noise coming from behind the house. It was muffled, like it might have been a back door opening or something, but I couldn't tell for sure. Feeling creeped out, I picked up my pace and got into my car. As I started it up, I looked up and saw the man coming around the side of the house, heading straight for my car. He had something in his hands, what looked like rope, along with something else I couldn't make out. My heart started racing as adrenaline kicked in. I shifted into reverse, trying to move quickly without getting stuck in the snow. The man got close, just a few feet away, before my car finally gained traction and started to move. I backed up all the way down the driveway, watching as the man eventually stopped and faded into the darkness. I don't know what his intentions were, but the whole experience was terrifying and confusing. I didn't want to stick around to find out what might have happened. I still do food deliveries, but I'm much more cautious now. Most of the time, I don't even knock anymore, I just leave the food on the porch and go. I can't help but think about what could have happened if I'd stayed any longer or had gone inside that house. It was a couple of days before Halloween, and I had a few days off work coming up. After finishing my shift, I was looking forward to staying up late and relaxing. On the way home, I grabbed some fast food and ate it on the couch while watching Netflix. About 30 minutes into the show, I decided to pause it and throw away the leftovers I hadn't finished. I walked into the kitchen and tossed the food in the trash, but when I turned around, I noticed someone standing in my backyard. They were just staring at my house, not moving or doing anything else. To give you some context, my backyard is small and fenced in, so there's no way this person just wandered in by accident. I flipped on the porch light and slid open the back door. "Hey, what are you doing?" I called out. With the light on, I could see their face more clearly. They looked young, probably in their 20s, but their eyes were tired and had a creepy intensity to them. The person didn't answer, so I yelled again, "You need to leave. This is my property." After a moment, they glanced at me, then slowly started walking toward the gate. I watched them from my front window as they walked down the street, making sure they were really gone. Once they had left, I sat for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was such a strange encounter. Why had they been standing in my backyard, staring at my house? Out of curiosity, I went outside and stood where they had been, looking up at the house to see if there was anything unusual, but there was nothing. I went back inside, trying to shake it off, and poured myself a drink before resuming my show. Maybe 20 minutes had passed when I heard footsteps in the backyard again, followed by a loud thud against the side of my house. I rushed to the kitchen and saw the same guy at my back door. This time, he was pressing his body against it and aggressively trying to pull it open. I grabbed the handle to reinforce the lock, but seeing him up close with that crazed, angry look in his eyes was terrifying. I backed away and called the police while watching him continue his attempts to force his way in. Suddenly, he stopped and just stared at me through the glass, breathing heavily, still with that wild look in his eyes. Then he slowly walked back toward the gate, but instead of leaving, he stayed somewhere out of sight along the side of my house. I kept checking all the windows, anxiously waiting for the police to arrive, hoping he wouldn't try anything else. After what felt like an eternity, about 5 minutes later, a police car finally pulled up. Just as they arrived, I heard footsteps again, but instead of running away, the guy ran back toward my door and tried to break in again. It was as if he'd rather risk getting caught than flee. Fortunately, the police were able to catch him in the act, and after a brief struggle, they managed to handcuff him and put him in the squad car. It was clear that the guy was under the influence of something, which was later confirmed through tests. Even after being questioned that night and again once he was sober, he never gave any clear reasons for his behavior. I'm not sure how to feel about it. Part of me thinks it was just some random guy on drugs with no real motive, so I shouldn't dwell on it. But another part of me can't forget the look in his eyes or the fact that he chose to try breaking in again instead of running away. It feels like he must have had some kind of intent, and the thought of what might have happened if he had gotten inside is terrifying, whether he had a reason or not. As far as I know, he was only jailed for a few weeks because of his impaired state, which leaves me wondering if he'll come back one day.